Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our buddy read of Mr. Scarborough's Family by Anthony Trollope. We have reached the point in the story where young Florence Montjoy, formerly the unofficial fiancée of Captain Montjoy Scarborough, has been packed up by her mother, Mrs. Montjoy, to her brother, Sir Magnus Montjoy, and his wife, Lady Montjoy, in Brussels. Far too many Montjoys. Sir Magnus is the minister plenipotentiary for the legation at Brussels, has a mansion there and a staff, including a young, handsome attaché. There's not much in the way of work going on at the Belgian embassy, but Mama Montjoy thinks that this is the best way to get Florence away from the influence of Harry Ainsley, uh, another good-looking young man who has pledged himself to Florence and to whom she has pledged herself. Mama Montjoy can't do anything about their secret correspondence, even though Florence tells her about the letters. She can't do anything about Harry Ainsley showing up at dances where her daughter might be. So rather than lock her daughter up in the basement, she decides to just take them both on the road. Just go and spend a long time away from England, hoping that that will change things. And Lady M also thinks that one look at Florence tells her that the young attachés that attend her husband will probably pitch woo to her. That might complicate the situation even more. And that's where we still are. We are still with Mama Montjoy and Florence and Sir Magnus and Lady M in Brussels. When we get to our next chapter, chapter 15, which is Mr. Anderson's love. Mr. Anderson is one of the young attachés. He's the young, handsome one. Fairly well set up in life, as we're going to see. And so, in a less maybe starchy or less nuanced romance novel of the time, he would be an obvious rival for Harry Ainsley. Now, is he? Florence protests left, right, and center that her devotion to Harry will never waver, that nothing could make it waver. We're going to see her do a lot more of that protesting in this chapter, but is she right? She's very young. Let's see. Let's see what happens in this chapter. Lady Montjoy had certainly prophesied the truth when she said that Mr. Anderson would devote himself to Florence. The first week in Brussels passed by quietly enough. A young man can hardly declare his passion within a week, and Mr. Anderson's ways in that particular were well known. A certain amount of license was usually given to him, both by Sir Magnus and Lady M, and when he would become remarkable by the rapidity of his changes, the only adverse criticisms would come generally from Mr. Blow. That's another employee at the embassy. Another peerless bird of paradise, Mr. Blow would say. If the birds were less numerous, Anderson might perhaps do something. In other words, he'd get more work done if he weren't constantly falling in love. But at the end of the week, on this occasion, even Sir Magnus perceived that Anderson was about to make himself peculiar. By George, he said one morning, when Sir Magnus was just left the outer office, which he had entered with the object of giving some instructions as to the day's ride, take her altogether, I never saw a girl so fit as Miss Montjoy. There was something very remarkable in this speech, as according to his usual habit of life, Anderson would certainly have called her Florence, whereas his present appellation showed an unwanted respect. So once again, it's a little thing, but once again we see a weird transitionless move from the one pronoun antecedent to another. Enough to throw you off for just a second. You're reading I for just a second. We see even Sir Magnus perceived that Anderson was about to make himself peculiar. By George, he said one morning, but that he is not Sir Magnus. That he is Anderson. A little bit jarring, that's all. I don't think that an earlier Trollope would have done this quite so often as he's doing it in this book. I pointed out 2 examples so far, but there have been 6 or 7. But anyway, he won't call her Florence. He calls her Miss Montjoy. What do you mean when you say a young lady is fit? Said Mr. Blow. I mean that she's right all round, which is a great deal more than can be said for most of them. The divine Florence, began Mr. Montgomery Arbuthnot, struggling to say something funny. He's making fun of how Anderson is always falling head over heels and using grandiloquent language. Young man, you had better hold your tongue and not talk of young ladies in that language. I do believe he is going to fall in love, said Mr. Blow. I say that Miss Mountjoy is the fittest girl I have seen for many a day, and when a young puppy calls her the divine Florence, he does not know what he is about." "Why didn't you blow Mr. Blow up when he called her a bird of paradise?" said Montgomery Arbuthnot. "Divine Florence is not half so disrespectful to a young lady as a bird of paradise. Divine Florence means divine Florence, but bird of paradise is chaff." "Mr. Blow is a married man," said Anderson, "and has a certain freedom allowed him. If he uses it in a bad taste, the evil falls back upon his own head. Now, if you please, we'll change the conversation." From this it will be seen that Mr. Anderson had really fallen in love with Miss Mountjoy. But though the week had passed in a harmless way to Sir Magnus and Lady Mountjoy, in a harmless way to them as regarded their niece and their attaché, a certain amount of annoyance had no doubt been felt by Florence herself. Though Mr. Anderson's expressions of admiration had been more subdued than usual, though he had endeavored to whisper his love rather than to talk it aloud, still the admiration had been both visible and audible, especially so to Florence herself. It was nothing to Sir Magnus, with whom his attaché flirted. Anderson was the younger son of a baronet who had a sickly elder brother. So Anderson is likely going to inherit, and some fortune of his own. If he chose to marry the girl, that would be well for her, and if not, it would be quite well that the young people should amuse themselves. He expected Anderson to help to put him on his horse, and to ride with him at the appointed hour. He, in return, gave Anderson his dinner and as much wine as he chose to drink. They were both satisfied with each other, and Sir Magnus did not choose to interfere with the young man's amusements. But Florence did not like being the subject of a young man's love-making, and complained to her mother. Now it had come to pass that not a word had been said as to Harry Annesley since the mother and daughter had reached Brussels. Mrs. Mountjoy had declared that she would consult her brother-in-law in that difficulty, but no such consultation had as yet taken place. Indeed, Florence would not have found her sojourn at Brussels to be unpleasant, were it not for Mr. Anderson's unpalatable little whispers. She had taken them as jokes as long as she had been able to do so, but was now at last driven to perceive that some other people would not do so. So she's noticing that other people are noticing that Anderson is serious. This is not just flirting. "Mamma," she said, "don't you think that Mr. Anderson is an odious young man?" "No, my dear, by no means. What is there odious about him? He is very lively, and he is the second son of Sir Gregory Anderson, and has very comfortable means of his own." "Oh, mamma, what does that signify?" "Well, my dear, it does signify. In the first place, he is a gentleman, and in the next, has a right to make himself attentive to a young lady in your position. I don't say anything more. I am not particularly wedded to Mr. Anderson. If he were to come to me and ask for my permission to address you, I should simply refer him to yourself, by which I should mean to imply that if he could contrive to recommend himself to you, I should not refuse my sanction." Then the subject for that moment dropped, but Florence was astonished to find that her mother could talk about it not only without reference to Harry Annesley, but also without apparent thought of Mountjoy Scarborough. And it was distressing to her to think that her mother should pretend to feel that she, her own daughter, should be free to receive the advances of another suitor. As she reflected, it came across her mind that Harry was so odious to her mother that her mother would have been willing to accept her on her behalf any suitor who presented himself, even though her daughter, in accepting him, should have proved herself to be heartless. Any alternative would have been better for her mother than the choice to which Florence had determined to devote her whole life. "Mamma," she said, going back to the subject the next day, "if I am to stay here for 3 weeks longer—" "Yes, my dear, you are to stay here for 3 weeks longer." "Then somebody must say something to Mr. Anderson." "I do not see who can say it but yourself. As far as I can see, he has not misbehaved." "I wish you would speak to my uncle." "What am I to tell him?" "That I am engaged." "He would ask me to whom, and I cannot tell him. I should then be driven to put the whole case in his hands and to ask his advice. You do not suppose that I am going to say that you are engaged to marry that odious young man. All right, Tony, you learned a new word. Let's lay off on the odious, okay?" All right. "All the world knows how atrociously badly he has behaved to your own cousin. He left him lying for dead in the street by a blow from his own hand. And though from that day to this nothing has been heard of Mountjoy, nothing is known to the police of what may be his fate, even stranger, he may have perished under the usage that he has received, yet Mr. Annesley has not thought it right to say a word of what has occurred. He has not dared even to tell an inspector of the police the events of that night. And the young man who was your own cousin, to whom you were known to have been promised for the last 2 years." "No, no," said Florence. "I say it was so. You were promised to your cousin, Mountjoy Scarborough." "Not with my own consent." All your friends, your natural friends, knew that it was to be so. And now you expect me to take by the hand this young man who has almost been his murderer? I might point out here that Mama Montjoy is getting all of this information about what happened that night from Augustus Scarborough, but notice she's not going to the police. She knows a little bit more about what happened that night than they do. She's not telling them. No, Mama, it is not true. You do not know the circumstances, and you assert things which are directly at variance with the truth. From whom do you get your information? From the young man himself. Is that likely to be true? What would Sir Magnus say if that is what I were to tell him? I do not know what he would say, but I do know what is the truth, and can you think it possible that I should now be willing to accept this foolish young man in order to thus put an end to my embarrassments? Then she left her mother's room, and retreating to her own, sat for a couple of hours thinking, partly in anger and partly in grief, of the troubles of her situation. As she left for her own room in the embassy mansion, with wildflowers growing on the vines outside, servants waiting on her every day, every hour of every day, wonderful dinners every night, beautiful weather, she retreats to reflect on the troubles of her situation. Her mother had now in truth frightened her as to Harry's position. When her mother puts it that way, it is pretty stark. She did begin to see what men might say of him, and the way in which they might speak of his silence, though she was resolved to be true to him with her faith as ever. Some exertion of spirit would indeed be necessary. She was beginning to understand that in what way the outside world might talk of Harry Annesley, of the man to whom she had given herself and her whole heart. Then her mother was right, and as she thought of it, she began to justify her mother. It was natural that her mother should believe the story which had been told to her, let it have come from where it might. There was in her mind some suspicion of the truth. She acknowledged a great animosity to her cousin Augustus, and regarded him as one of the causes of her unhappiness. So she is putting two and two together as to the only source where Mama Montjoy could possibly have got this information. But she knew nothing of the real facts. She did not even suspect that Augustus had seen his brother after Harry had dealt with him, or that he was responsible for his brother's absence. But she knew that she disliked him, and in some way she connected his name with Harry's misfortune. Of one thing she was quite certain. Let them, the Montjoys, the Prospers, the rest of the world, think and say what they would of Harry, she would be true to him. She could understand that his character might be made to suffer, but it should not suffer in her estimation, or rather let it suffer so, that should not affect her love and her truth. She did not say this to herself. By saying it even to herself, she would have committed some default of truth. What does Trollope mean by that? She did not whisper it even in her own heart, but within her heart there was a feeling that, let Harry be right or wrong in what he had done, even let it be proved, to the satisfaction of all the world, that he had sinned grievously when he had left the man stunned and bleeding on the pavement, for to such details her mother's story had gone. Still to her he should be braver, more noble, more manly, more worthy of being loved than any other man. She, perceiving the difficulties that were in store for her, and looking forward to the misfortune under which Harry might be placed, declared to herself that he should at least have one friend who would be true to him. So what is it that Florence is not whispering even to her own heart? You can see it in this paragraph. It's subtle. Trollope is always accused of not being subtle. He can be when he wants to be. What is it that we are being told these things about her that she isn't even willing to know about herself? What is in this paragraph that was never in any of her thoughts about Harry before? The possibility that he might be guilty. The possibility that the horrible characterization that her mother put on events might be true. The possibility that she might have to stand by him even though he brutally attacked his cousin and left him for dead. Or her cousin, and left him for dead. Some part of her, below her own thought, Trollope tells us she's not even thinking of this, but some part of her is starting to wonder if maybe that might be necessary. This is a change. The only thing that could make it worse if, in addition to this kind of inner wavering, someone pitches woo to her. Miss Montjoy, I have come to you with a message from your aunt. This was said 3 or 4 days after the conversation between Florence and her mother by Mr. Anderson, who had contrived to follow the young lady into the small drawing-room after luncheon. What was the nature of this message it is not necessary for us to know. We may be sure that it had been manufactured by Mr. Anderson for the occasion. He had looked about and spied, and had discovered that Miss Mountjoy was alone in the little room, and in thus spying we consider him to have been perfectly justified. His business at the moment was that of making love, a business which is allowed to override all other considerations. Even the making of an office copy of a report by Mr. Blow for the signature of Sir Magnus might, according to our view of life, have been properly laid aside for such a purpose. That is the narrator telling us that that is what Mr. Anderson should be doing right now. He should be making a fair copy, and he's not. When a young man has it in him to make love to a young lady, it is and is earnest in his intentions, no duty, however paramount, should be held as a restraint. Such was Mr. Anderson's intention at the present moment, and therefore we think that he was justified in concocting a message from Lady Mountjoy. The business of love-making warrants any concoction to which the lover may resort. But, oh, Miss Mountjoy, I am so glad you have a moment in which I can find you alone. It must be understood that the amorous young gentleman had not yet been acquainted with the lady for quite a fortnight. Things are moving quickly here in Brussels. I was just about to go upstairs to my mother, said Florence, rising to leave the room. Oh, bother your mother. I beg her pardon, and yours. I really don't mean it. There is such a lot of chaff going on in that outer room that a fellow falls into the way of it whether he likes it or not. Shouldn't have said bother, her mother. My mother won't mind it at all, but I really must go. Oh, no, I am sure you can wait for 5 minutes. I don't want to keep you more than 5 minutes. But it is so hard for a fellow to get an opportunity to say a few words. Notice that when Harry met her at the dance, he also asked for 5 minutes. What word can you have to say to me, Mr. Anderson? This she said with a look of great surprise, as though utterly unable to imagine what was to follow. Well, I did hope that you might have some idea what my feelings are. Not in the least. Haven't you now? I suppose I am bound to believe you, though I doubt whether I quite do. Pray excuse me for saying this, but it is best to be open. Florence felt that he ought to be excused from doubting her, as she did know very well what was coming. Come then, I love you. If I were to go on beating about the bush for 12 months, I could only come to the same conclusion. Perhaps you might have considered it better. Not in the least. Fancy considering such a thing as that for 12 months before you speak of it. I couldn't do it, not for 12 days. So I perceive, Mr. Anderson. Well, isn't it best to speak the truth when you're quite sure of it? If I had remained dumb for 3 months, how should I know but what someone else might come in the way? But you can't expect that I should be so sudden. That's just where it is. Of course I don't. And yet girls have been sudden too. Have they? They're expected to be ready with their answer as soon as they're asked. I don't say this by way of impertinence, but merely to show that I have some justification. Of course, if you like to say that you must take a week to think of it, I am prepared to wait. I'm prepared for that. Only let me tell you my own story first. You shall tell your own story, Mr. Anderson, but I'm afraid it can be to no purpose. Don't say that. Pray, don't say that. But do let me tell it. And then he paused, but as she remained silent, after a moment he resumed with the eloquence of his appeal. Notice she is remaining silent. By George, Miss Mountjoy, I have been so struck of a heap that I do not know whether I am standing on my head or my heels. You have knocked me off so completely off my pins that I am not at all like the same person. Sir Magnus himself says he never saw such a difference. I only say that to show that I am quite in earnest. But I am not quite like a fellow who has no business to fall in love with a girl. I have 400 a year beside my place in the Foreign Office, and then, of course, there are chances. In this he alluded to his brother's failing health, of which he could not explain the details to Miss Mountjoy on the present occasion. But if his brother dies, then he is the heir to a baronet. I don't mean to say that this is very splendid, or that it is half what I should like to be able to lay at your feet, but a competence is comfortable. Money has nothing to do with it, Mr. Anderson. What then? Perhaps it is that you don't like a fellow. What girls generally do like is devotion, and by George, you'd have that. The very ground that you tread upon is sweet to me. For beauty, I don't know how it is, but to my taste there is no one I ever saw at all like you. You fit me, well, as though you were made for me. I know that another fellow might say it a deal better, and no one more truly. Miss Mountjoy, I love you with all my heart, and I want you to be my wife. Now you've got it. He had not pleaded his cause badly, and so Florence felt. That he had pleaded it hopelessly was a matter of course, but he had given rise to feelings of gentle regard rather than of anger. He had been honest, and had contrived to make her believe him. He did not come up to her ideal of what a lover should be, but he was nearer to it than Mountjoy Scarborough. He had touched her so closely that she determined at once to tell him the truth, thinking that she might best in this way put an end to his passions forever. "Mr. Anderson," she said, though I have known it to be vain, I have thought it best to listen to you, because you asked it. "I am sure awfully obliged to you. But I ought to thank you for the kind feeling you have expressed to me. Indeed, I do thank you. I believe every word you have said. It is better to show my confidence in your truth than to pretend the humility of thinking you untrue." "It is true. It is true. Every word of it." "I don't believe it. I'm sure that Mr. Anderson feels it, but I think he could lose his heart to another pretty face in 2 seconds. But I am engaged." Then it was sad to see the thorough change which came over the young man's face. "Of course a girl does not talk of her own little affairs to strangers, or I would have let you know this before, so as to have prevented it. But in truth, I am engaged." "Does Sir Magnus know it, or Lady Mountjoy?" "I should think not." "Does your mother?" "Now you are taking advantage of my confidence, and pressing your question too closely. But my mother does know of it. I will tell you more. She does not approve of it, but it is fixed in heaven itself. It may well be that I shall never be able to marry the gentleman to whom I allude, but most certainly I shall never marry anyone else. I have told you this because it seems necessary to your welfare, so that you may get over this passing feeling." "It is no passing feeling," said Anderson, with some tragic grandeur. "At any rate, you have now my story, and remember that it is trusted to you as a gentleman. I have told it to you for a purpose." Then she walked out of the room, leaving the poor young man in temporary despair. Key word there being temporary, I would think, because Mr. Anderson is young and dumb and full of expectations, and the rival is not only nowhere around, he's not in Brussels, he's hundreds of miles away, but also is disapproved of by the lady's mother, who would approve, as he will learn, of anybody else. It's not likely that an ardent young man will simply drop his suit in such a circumstance. That's unlikely. Let's just put it that way. And that ends this chapter. Florence has no sooner got to Brussels than she is starting to be the object of wooing by another young man, which complicates the love story between her and Harry Ainsley back, in England and down at Buston. And that is the chapter, which continues on here. We didn't have much of the interplay of the legation staff or of Lady M or whatnot. But there's something, it's very entertaining stuff, but there's something missing here that's been missing all throughout the book. I don't know if you quite noticed it or not. There are characters in this story so far that we can like. I think we are definitely supposed to like Mr. Scarborough, even though he's been acting like a thorough scamp. Even though he has not only disinherited his eldest son, after intending fraudulently to let him claim the estate, but also thereby traduced the memory of his wife. It brought her name into joking, into the common discourse, in a way that certainly is not respectful, certainly is not loving. There's something hard about Mr. Scarborough, something almost inhuman. And then there's Mountjoy Scarborough, who is coarse. I think some of us, some not, some of us might feel a little sympathy for him in the situation that he's in. Some of you have written to me and said you most certainly do not, that all of his problems are of his own making. His father wouldn't have disinherited him if he hadn't gambled away everything, and more than everything. But we've been told that he's selfish and self-centered and a bit coarse and a bit brutal. That's nothing compared to his brother, Augustus Scarborough, who makes your flesh creep. He is a thoroughly loathsome figure, and has hangers-on like Septimus Jones, who are not real characters, but they're also not savory. There's nothing nice about them. And then there's Mrs. Mountjoy, who is fixed in her guardianship of her daughter, but unfeeling in that guardianship. And there's Florence, who is devoted to Harry, but like Harry is a bit of an imbecile. just a bit of an imbecile. And there's Sir Magnus, and there's Lady M, and they're the creditors. Just, let's not even talk about the caricatures going on there. This is all very interesting. This is all very entertaining. We're following all of these people. We're following all of these plot lines. I'm very pleased to know from all of your emails that you are all enjoying this. That's great. Trollope is not a dead author. He has the ability to just pull you in. I believe in a way that Dickens, for instance, his great contemporary, does not. But there's one thing missing from all of those characters, from all of this cast that we are following, that we've been following all this time. There's one thing missing, and that is someone you can just unambiguously like. And also someone that Trollope just unambiguously likes. He likes Mr. Scarborough. I think that's pretty clear. But not unambiguously. He likes Mr. Scarborough for his to hell with you attitude. But he'd rather the hell with you attitude not be necessary or be present. Mr. Scarborough is a compromised figure for him, not only morally, but also by the time this book starts, physically. But what about a character that he can really like, and that we can really like? A character that doesn't have this 30,000-foot wry satirical overview. What's an example? There are plenty of examples in Trollope. My favorite, of course, would be Glencora Palliser in the Palliser novels. But we haven't had that yet in this book. And I don't know if you've noticed it. I don't know if you've missed it. I don't know if you've been reading along saying, well, you know, I'm interested in what happens to virtually everyone in this book, but I don't care about any of them. In an immediately empathetic way, I don't care about any of them. If you've been feeling that, that's about to change. The next chapter is going to start to change that. So I hope you'll stick around. But anyway, that is our next chapter of Mr. Scarborough's Family. We'll wrap this up for now, and I'll join you all next time. Thank you, BookTube.